We're less than 24 hours into this ceasefire, and Iran is accusing the United States of violating the agreement. The Speaker of Iran's parliament says the U.S. and Israel have broken the terms in 3 ways, including non-compliance with the ceasefire in Lebanon after Israel launched a wave of strikes there. He says there was entry of an intruding drone into Iranian airspace, as well as denial of Iran's right to nuclear enrichment after the U.S. president said it couldn't enrich uranium. The speaker said that in this situation, a bilateral ceasefire or negotiations is unreasonable. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance says there are still supposed to be peace talks with Iran this weekend, but he's also disagreeing with Iran on what terms were actually part of the ceasefire.
Look, if Iran wants to let this negotiation fall apart in a conflict where they were getting hammered over Lebanon, which has nothing to do with them and which the United States never once said was part of the ceasefire, that's ultimately their choice. We think that would be dumb, but that's their choice.
So where did the U.S. and Iran leave this conflict, and what does that mean for whether they will restart the war? I want to bring in someone who has served as Canada's top soldier. Retired General Tom Lawson is a former chief of the Defence Staff and the chair of the board at the Conference of Defence Associations Institute. Hello, thank you for making time today.
Nice to be with you, Catherine.
The U.S. and Iran already disagreeing about the terms of this ceasefire, including Iran's ability to enrich uranium, the question of whether or not Lebanon is included in the pause. What is your sense of how close we might be to seeing this conflict resume a mere 24 hours after it's been put on pause?
No, I don't think so. I think what we're seeing is a complete misalignment between what the Americans were saying had been agreed to and what had actually been negotiated. And I think there's a good reason for that. I think the Americans see this as their way out. The last manic text from the president that threatened the annihilation of a civilization was simply it was gaslighting. He knew he had a military that would not follow illegal orders, which those certainly would have been. So that was a last chance to scare the Iranians into something when he knew that he would be withdrawing. And I think they're well on their way to withdrawing.
That is a remarkable framing. And of course, it very much, perhaps not surprisingly, clashes with what the White House is saying today. White House spokesperson saying that there's victory in this operation. What do you make of that assessment?
Well, there's certainly something that has been accomplished. And I think most of what was accomplished by the Americans and the Israelis occurred in the first week. And that's, if you'll remember back, most NATO allies who were somewhat offended about not having been consulted or even informed about this showed some support or at least silence, including our own prime minister. But since then, the killing of many members of the regime and the defanging of much of the Iranian military, that was followed up by 3 weeks of increasing punishment that seemed to be getting nowhere. And then we saw the Iranians becoming increasingly aggressive and almost having fun with the communications. And so I think that anything that was actually accomplished happened in the first week. And there is nothing of lasting value that has been accomplished here at all, even though there has been a certain defanging of some of the capabilities that Iran used to have.
That defanging, I mean, Levitt saying today the U.S. set back Iran's ability to make ballistic missiles by years, completely annihilated Iran's Navy. How significant is that?
Well, those are things. I think if you remember, what everybody was hopeful for in the first week was a change of regime that might perhaps even bring this country back into the international fold in some way. There's been absolutely no move towards that. There was a hope that maybe there could be some negotiations, even with a tough regime, to have them give up their nuclear, their move towards nuclear weapons. That hasn't happened at all. And then there was a hope that they would just cease being supportive of proxy groups, and we see that they are just as supportive of Hezbollah as they ever were. So no, I don't think anything has been achieved here that can be crowed about by the Americans.
The Prime Minister signed this joint statement with many European allies, which supports efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The Defense Minister previously suggested, I believe on this program, that any efforts to do that could include vessels, demining expertise, cyber capabilities. How likely do you think it is that Canada will deploy that kind of support to help in the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I think this ties into the question of whether NATO, and I think there's a really strange calculus going on there. Right now, the president is seeking retribution against NATO members who did not seem supportive enough, maybe speaking behind his back during the last month or so. But I think there's a calculus within NATO, too, that they'll go to a certain distance to please the United States in the hopes that they will remain within NATO. But there's another edge to that calculus. And I think for the first time after this horrific war, most NATO members are thinking that there may be another alternative, and one that sees 31 members of NATO carrying on without, God forbid, the member they all relied on for 60-some years as the key member. And so, while Trump seeks to punish NATO, I think we'll see more and more NATO members seeking some way ahead that tries to defend against a member who increasingly is becoming belligerent, even against members of NATO.
To that point, the Wall Street Journal reporting that the Trump administration is considering a plan to punish some members of NATO that he believes were unhelpful to the U.S. and Israel during the war, says the proposal would involve moving U.S. troops out of NATO member countries deemed unhelpful to the Iran war effort and stationing them in countries that were more supportive of the U.S. military campaign. What do you make of claims like that, or possibilities, I suppose?
Again, it's a thing, and it's very Trumpian. But I do think, to be completely candid, the other 31 members long for a year ago, and the type of year that followed 60-some years before that, where the United States was the key member of ally. But I think there's an increasing realization that this is an ally that they can't trust, they can't rely on. It's a president who has become lawless and belligerent to so many others, supported by a sycophantic administration, with a Congress that seems to have no interest in reining him in, and a population that has become less and less kind and generous to the rest of the world. So this is a United States that we've got to get used to, and I think NATO will see these punishments as something they're going to start having to accept from the United States as they distance themselves from this increasingly unreliable ally.
And yet they're not just another member of NATO. They're so pivotal to the alliance. They have such a powerful military. What would it mean to have a NATO without the United States? It is in many ways a completely different entity, is it not?
Absolutely, and not the entity that it was. Just a year ago, article after article said that if the United States was to pull out, NATO would not exist. I never thought that. I believe it can exist. 31 free Western countries, all of them democracies, some of them sliding a little bit, but just about all of them democracies carrying very good GDPs and economies. That's something for the Russians to have to deal with, and other parts of the world to have to deal with, even without the United States. To your point, however, it will not be the same. Whenever NATO moved into operations, they always relied upon the United States to provide the backbone and the overarching capabilities, communications, and logistic capabilities that no others could provide. They'll have to learn to provide that, and I don't think NATO will shut down. I think it becomes, in fact, increasingly important, especially as Russia is delighted with how this whole thing has gone, as they've refilled their coffers and will redouble their efforts against Ukraine.
Okay. Thank you very much for your insights on this. I really appreciate it, Retired General Tom Lawson.